Okay, great. We are officially live here for Takes Action Session 2. Thank you to everyone for attending. We've got a great set of speakers today, and we have two deans from two institutions in two countries. So we're ready to get started. We're pleased to have Dean Rob Wright from University of Toronto and Dean Keith Crumwitty from California College of the Arts to welcome us.
Hello and welcome to the sixth event of our Daniels Faculty 2020-21 Talks and Lecture Series, which is entitled Resolution and Agencies. My name is Rob Wright and I am the Dean of the Daniels Faculty at the University of Toronto. We are delighted to continue our cross-coastal and international collaboration with the California College of the Arts. First, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to welcome Keith Crumwitty, Dean at CCA, and our collaborator on this three-part event.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome everyone. I'm very happy to continue our collaboration with the Daniels faculty and ORO editions with this second session of Bracket Takes Action, the seventh event in our CCA lecture series for fall 2020 titled Remaking, which includes a variety of events from book launches, lectures, and public conversations. You can learn more about our programs, including our next event, a lecture by Mario Gooden next Monday, the 12th of October, by visiting our new content channel, scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. It's also customary for our school to acknowledge the land on which we operate. The California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yalamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay our respect to local elders, including those on the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. Now to your hosts, Niraj Bhatia and Mason White.
Hi, thank you so much, Keith. My name is Niraj Bhatia. I'm an associate professor at CCA and also founder of the design practice, The Open Workshop. Thank you for joining us for the virtual launch of Bracket Takes Action. This is the second of 3 sessions on the topic, and I'll be hosting along with my co-editor, Mason White, who's a professor at the University of Toronto and partner of Lateral Office. Before getting started, we wanted to thank CCA, the Daniels faculty at the University of Toronto, and AR&D Publishing for co-sponsoring this event. In particular, thank you to Keith Crumwitty, Rob Wright, and Gordon Goff for the support of this project. We also want to thank the Graham Foundation, who has been a consistent supporter of the Bracket project since its inception, our media partner, Archinect, as well as Harler Brun, our graphic designer for this issue. Lastly, thank you to the contributors for sharing their inspiring work today. And last but not least, thank you to the CCA and Daniels team behind the scenes, Nini, Sarah, Aiden, as well as Hannah.
So each issue of Bracket addresses an urgent contemporary theme on architecture, environment, and digital culture. This 4th issue addresses the notion of action in spatial practice and the complex interplay between politics, society, and space. Hannah Arendt's 1958 treatise, The Human Condition, cites action as one of the 3 tenets, along with labor and work, of the vita active, or active life. Action, she writes, is a necessary catalyst for, quote, the human condition of plurality, end quote, which is an expression of the common public and the distinct individual. However, more than 50 years later, we appear in a multitude of ways. Therefore, the role of spatial practice in relation to forms of action also needs to be re-examined. Spatial practice's role of anticipating, resisting, organizing, or absorbing action has been broadly challenged by shifts in notions of publicness, social practices, and roles of government. How and where to act is increasingly complex as it requires new techniques and assemblies to reflect the tendencies of distinct factions and their associated values.
So the issue on Takes Action emerged from conversations dating all the way back to 2016 between Mason and I, reacting to a series of events from the Arab Spring to the Occupy Wall Street movement to the Umbrella movement. These were all forms of action that used the space of the city as a theater for assembly. 2020 presents an ever wider range of conditions for design to respond to action. We wanted these issues to probe all the different ways that action was emerging and ask how design might incite forms of socio-political action. These forms of action span from the domestic realm to the public space, to online to offline, from confrontation to subtle recalibrations.
So in the book, Takes Action, the collection of essays and projects is structured into 6 sub-themes: reaction, counteraction, interaction, faction, inaction, and retroaction. These themes reveal the diversity of issues, methods, and most importantly, relevancy of the topic to designers and design thinkers. This second section that we're hosting today includes 2 of the topics. The first one, interaction, consists of projects and articles that consider how participatory interactions can occur, how new stakeholders are introduced, and how the relationships between people and their environment impact politics. Or what is the spatial agency of the individual in relation to the pluralistic collective? Today, we're fortunate that interaction is represented by Albert Pope and Sama Elimam. Sama Elimam is a PhD candidate at Harvard GSD, researching the history of engineering, empire, and the making of the past in the Nile Valley. She has previously worked as a designer at architecture offices in Cairo, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Albert Pope is the Gus Sessions Wortham Professor of Architecture at Rice University, where he's also the director of the Present Future program and author of the recently reissued edition of Ladders.
So the second theme we'll be talking about today are factions. These are situated within a particular constituency and interrogate how these groups act internally as well as interface with other groups. These projects and articles foreground the commonality of the subject as a way to consider specific forms of action. In what way is the formation and emergence of subcollectives informed and empowered by design? And today we're super lucky to have Cesar Lopez and Lori Brown presenting their articles in the issue. Cesar Lopez is an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico, an associate at the Open Workshop. Lori Brown is professor at Syracuse University, where she also is director of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And to launch the series, AR&D, our publisher, is offering a 30% off discount, and we'll include in the chat either Niraj or links. If you press spacebar, you mute yourself. Links in the chat so that you can get access to the 30% off code for international and US Canada orders. So that's in there. And I think we are ready to begin presentations. And I believe we are starting with Sama.
Great. I'll get started. Let's see. All right. Everyone see that? Is that good? Okay, great. All right. Okay, so thank you, Mason and Niraj, for the invitation and for organizing this panel. I think it's been a very useful exercise for me to revisit something I was thinking about a while back in light of our current moment. So my article was taking a critical look at the overwhelming use of aerial views to represent the 2011 Tahrir Square uprisings in Cairo, their circulation and reproduction through news and social media. And as striking as it is for any viewer, and you know, it's the front flap of our beautiful bracket, I argued that this obscures the plurality of individuals, their motivations and interests, political or otherwise, at work in the square. And in the article, I was thinking of it through this framework of Kevin Lynch's classic study on what legibility might mean for the individual in the city, and speculating on what other objects might start to ground this abstraction. So today I'll pick up on 2 threads from the article, media and the aerial view, and then the question of legibility. And for me, what I was asking in the article was legibility for whom? The aerial view, right, emphasizes this homogeneity, a collective, and the way that I was reading it was that it was primarily for a global audience. But I also knew that there were other stakeholders, and knowing something about post-1952 political history of Egypt and the fundamental role of the army in all of Egyptian politics and the interests of religious groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, I knew this was more complicated. And for some historians, what was happening could simply be modeled as a power triangle between the army, security, and politicians, where the collective really has no say. I think I'm a little less cynical than that, but to kind of think of where I was about 10 years ago now, when I was thinking about this, I was an MArch, or when the uprisings happened, I was an MArch student in Cambridge, Massachusetts, occupying both the categories of citizen and global audience, watching and reading the news online and seeing overhead images again and again, but at the same time speaking on the phone with family and friends in Cairo and hearing about individual experiences inside and out of the square. And so I knew that people out there ranged from, private university students demanding more political freedoms and the right to expression and partisanship, to unemployed men and women with little to no food security. So what frustrated me, I think, about the aerial views was the abstraction of this inequality, which was made legible only for foreign consumption. And so the question was, what would legibility be for the citizen, or for someone like myself, a citizen watching from the outside? And I think that's what captivated me about about this protester making a model in the square in 2011, and it reached me through a photographer friend, and I wondered why this protester made it. And that's basically what the article revolves around. In it, I talk about how the model is a tool of legibility for that protester and the many others who assembled around it, to make sense of their environment, to discuss, to take pictures, to visualize, to touch, to replay traumatic incidents like the Battle of the Camels, to compare how each person experienced those incidents. So I also talk about in the article how this is a square within a square, and how it moved between traffic islands in Tahrir overnight. And at the same time, there's this kind of playful, satirical take on it. So this $1 bill represents the building of the American University in Cairo in Tahrir. And then this KFC sign is a symbol for the apartment building with a KFC on the ground floor. So it's also like humorous in this way. And so alongside this, in the article, I also reflected on the pamphlet put together by Egyptian activists on how to protest, complete with where to go, right? On the bottom, how to avoid, police blockades, and what to wear, right? And this was distributed not through social media, but through email and hard copy. So I started thinking that what was interesting to me was the issue of media and protest, and asking the question, how does a citizen really make sense of what's happening around them on the ground, and what's the material stuff they use to do that? And I think the model and the pamphlet were some examples. And back in Cambridge, I was asked with a colleague to curate an exhibition on Tahrir in April 2012, and we decided to rebuild this model and have it be the center of our exhibit. And now that I think about it, I could think about like a problem of decontextualization, or picking this up and putting it in an academic context. But I think that was kind of our attempt to negotiate the intermediary position between citizen and global audience. And it was interesting to see how a foreign audience interacted with it in a new, more personal way of seeing Tahrir, as opposed to what they were used to seeing on the news. And so I think of that model now, and I did some reading, and I started thinking about the speed and simplicity of network protests that seems to be propagated by the aerial view. And I came across writer and activist Zainab Tufekci, who was in the square for the first 2 weeks of the uprising, and recalls that once she saw broadcasts of an aerial shot, it was, quote, jarring and alienating compared to the intimate yet incomplete views she had of the square. These images capture the ability of a networked protest to rapidly gather large numbers of protesters, but for Tufekci, it's a double-edged sword. She writes, quote, once this large group is formed, however, it struggles because it has sidestepped some of the drudgery of traditional organizing that helps create collective decision-making capabilities and builds a collective capacity among movement participants through shared experience and tribulation. So in a way, I think thinking of the model now seemed like a way to slow down that speed and tenuousness depicted in the aerial view, and for myself and maybe for the protester too, and just to give him a little bit of credit, he's the man in the top picture in the in the green headband. Building the model was a way to take our time to not only read the environment that a simple search for legibility might imply, but also to make it, to build it, to narrate it, and maybe to redesign it. So I was thinking now, what has become of the square? And I was in Cairo last winter, and I saw this. As most people do, I drove through Tahrir Square regularly, and this was the view, and apparently this is what it looks like now. This is a Ramses II obelisk, an ancient obelisk, and 4 ram sculptures surrounding it. They were moved from the southern city of Luxor. And so very simply, right, this is the erasure of recent history by the insertion of a monument to an ancient past that we've seen in other contexts. In response to the backlash by people and archaeologists, the justification by the Minister of Tourism and Antiquities is that all European cities, quote, decorate their major squares with our obelisks, so why don't we do the same? So I can go on and on here about, you know, the problematic reference to imperial practices and archaeology and empire and so on, but I'll limit myself to this line by art historian Todd Porterfield that I came across, who writes on the Place de la Concorde obelisk in 1830s Paris, and he writes, quote, the July monarchy imported the obelisk to obliterate the history of the site and to stave off the post-revolutionary crisis of legitimacy. And I couldn't help but think how easy it would be to replace current Egyptian government instead of July monarchy. But the point is that there's nothing more legible than this, right? In a very Lynchian way, the landmark in the center of a node in a downtown in a huge metropolis. And the specific choice of an obelisk is also relevant for the less known parading of the martyr obelisk to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of Tahrir. So on the left here, there is this, I think it's a plywood obelisk that protesters built a year later inscribed with the names of martyrs. And so this erasure of the site's history that's happening on the right here amounts to something like a legibility war, right? Who decides what's going to remain of these uprisings? So in this light, the obelisk, I think, complicates the question of legibility that I was interested in before in the article. So it's not just for whom, but what kind of legibility, and more than form, what is the content, and is it even always desirable? So I wanted to end by reflecting on Tahrir and the George Floyd protests earlier this year. There's many similarities and probably many more differences, but I was thinking of kind of the relationship of protest and monument, and talking with a friend about, you know, are these counter monuments? On the left, a monument to systemic racism cloaked in what we should rightly memorialize and be reckoning with, and on the right, a miniature space of revolt that became a unifying social object. And I think these remind us that while we work on the slower strategies of movement building that Tufekci urges, those things that endure in the long term, we also need to work on or attend to capturing them through media that can carry forth the momentum and the stories told by these exciting but otherwise fleeting images like the aerial view. So I think it's one step further than trying to understand this through the aerial image. It might be still insufficient, but it at least pushes us to ask how we, as designers and historians, might make more of these media. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Elimam. Let's go on to Albert Pope, please.
Thanks a lot. Let me find everything right. I appreciate being a part of this. Thanks for putting it together, and thanks for this incredibly ambitious challenge. Who we are, how we live, and how we communicate. I don't quite know how to really follow through on that, but it's definitely at the core of the essay, which I wrote 4 years ago, and continually to think through, including what I'm saying right now. I'm going to read because I got to, in 10 minutes, I'm going to have to go real fast, so I'm just going to spit this out. Despite the fact that the essay was written in 2014, the statement of Brackett aligns to its core conviction. That conviction concerns the relationship between ourselves, both individually and collectively, and the objects that we make. This subject-object relationship sounds simple enough, but as I try to show in the essay, its apparent simplicity masks a good amount of political complacency and inaction. This is how, the quote in front of you now is how the subject-object relationship is expressed in Mumford's 1938 Culture of Cities. Mind takes form in the city, and in turn, urban forms condition mind. For space, no less than time, is artfully reorganized in cities, in boundary lines and silhouettes, in the fixing of horizontal planes and vertical peaks, in utilizing or denying the natural site. The city records the attitude of a culture, the fundamental facts of its existence. The open avenue and the closed court tell the story not merely of different physical accommodations, but of essentially different conceptions of human destiny. The city is both a physical utility for collective living and a symbol of those collective purposes and unanimities that arise under such favoring circumstance. With language itself, it remains humanity's greatest work of art. This passage sounds a little bit naive today, mostly because it's very difficult for us to see how our own world, parking garages, franchise kiosk, housing tracts, big box retail, how our own world could ever be a reflection of ourselves. Even harder to see how these urban forms represent, in Mumford's words, a conception of human density, a destiny. Can we speak of freeways and strip malls as humanity's greatest work of art? I would answer this question with the supposition that there's no getting around the subject-object dynamic. I'm convinced that forms influence our actions as much as actions influence our forms, and that in spite of the banality of our urban production, there's a direct relationship between who we are and the things that we make. In this regard, when I heard of a call to action, first thing I asked was not who or how, but where. The urgency of the question is owed to the fact that we no longer build the kind of urban spaces that support public action. And we have not done so for the past 6 or 7 decades. What we build instead, what we do instead is to borrow the streets and plazas of our urban past, spaces that were built in the image of our ancestors' urban cultures. My hypothesis in the essay is that we not only borrow our ancestors' urban spaces, we borrow their political identity as well. The street protester, upon whom we invest so much of our hopes and energies, is a political identity that was forged in a different place for a different time and for political problems that are different from our own. Coming from this perspective, a key question emerges. What political identity can be made from the environments that we ourselves build? In my essay, I use the example of Hong Kong, where the public spaces of the 2014 umbrella revolution took place in Hong Kong Central. The urban core that was first laid out in the 19th century, and that did not occur in the new towns where Hong Kong has been built over the past 50 years and where the majority of the population now lives. This is because apart from a few large markets and a few large subway platforms, there are no spaces of public city in the new towns. The umbrella revolution was largely staged in the massive street caverns of Hong Kong's urban core. Just a few metro stops away is the new town Sha Tin, whose urban core is a rectangular canal, a product of land reclamation. The core of Sha Tin is not made of form, it's made of space, and that space is not occupiable. What is so interesting about the new town is that there is a centralized effect, as you can see in this drawing, but there's no representative political space, only its palpable absence. Had I the time, if I had the time, I could dwell on the same absence of a collective accommodation in practically every city that has been economically viable over the past 7 decades. But instead, I will simply restate, if the forms we build, if the forms that we actually build influence action as much as actions influence form, who is the characteristic subject, political actor that arise out of the urban forms that we have produced over the past half century? This is where I live. In the essay, I raised the fact that the urban spaces that we have produced do not support a public assembly. Today, we build mass housing tracts, office and industrial parks, commercial centers that are distinguished by the absence of traditionally formed anthropomorphically scaled streets and plazas. They are built like Sha Tin to accommodate, if not celebrate, individual rather than collective life. Recognizing the subject-object link, the link between who we are and what we make, forces us to see that the spaces of the past were made for different economic, political, and cultural actions that resulted in entirely different outcomes. Today, the demonstrations that take place in our inherited urban spaces provide a form of public catharsis, but they rarely affect change as they did in the past. Sadly, the protests of Hong Kong and Black Lives Matter are not the October Revolution. Ferguson, Missouri is not St. Petersburg, and this is not 1917. In 1917, we were still building streets and public squares, even palaces. Today, the only palace we can hope to storm are consumer palaces, and this, of course, is called looting. So while the public catharsis is real, its political efficacy is not. The point is not to eliminate protest, however, but to refashion our modes of political efficacy. This can be done by questioning the modes of protest we have inherited. In the essay, I contrasted the effectiveness of the woman or man on the street, the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, to the isolated man or woman behind the computer, say Edward Snowden, a political actor that did not even exist 20 years ago. The ineffectiveness of political protests against the fossil fuel industry are actually a better case in point. The Keystone Pipeline protests in Washington and the 2014 and 2017 People's Climate March in New York remain inconclusive because the target of the protests remain elusive. I would argue that these protests employ the unreconstructed logic of Vietnam-era politics that were revived in Occupy Wall Street to little or no effect. The simplistic us versus them finger pointing of 60s politics does not work today, largely because we live in a different political moment and face entirely different problems. With regards to climate change, we are the problem, and the solutions will not come until we are able to point a finger individually at our own patterns of consumption and emission. While the oil companies are targets of these protests, they are at best a proxy for our own culpability in the changing climate. While certainly culpable themselves, pointing fingers at oil companies is a distraction from that basic fact. From the perspective of climate change, far more interesting was the wonderful David and Goliath narrative that sprung from the protests of the so-called kayaktivists. While they were still engaged in finger pointing, they suggested a newly aware political actor. They used the harbor of Seattle, not its streets, to take on Shell's mammoth drilling rig that was being towed through the harbor on the way to drill in an ice-free Arctic. The punchline was, of course, that oil was used to mass produce the plastic kayaks. The correlation created a real affinity between the Lilliputian boats and the behemoth that brought them into existence. And most important, I don't think the irony that these kayaks are a petroleum product was lost on anyone. And more importantly, the protests did not keep anyone from producing or buying more kayaks. While Vietnam era politics have their place, today they play out as occasions for political theater as much as political action. And this is really the point. The recognition that protesting is a particular form of public theater does not mean that it can have an effect. My own idea of a political actor comes from an actual Vietnam era activist, Abby Hoffman, who questioned the efficacy of street protesters in his own day. His critique, which you probably know, was summed up in a simple phrase. Free speech is the right to shout theater in a crowded fire. I like the way that we have to sort of stop for a second and figure out what that means. The point is that we have to develop a form of cultural protest that is far more sophisticated than a Molotov cocktail or looting to confront our enormous social and environmental problems. We have to figure out a way to get over the us versus them finger pointing and search out a political actor that is capable of pointing a finger at him or herself. This self, the highly individuated subject of contemporary urbanism, is already reflected in the things of this world. Already reflected in the things of this world. How we expand that sense of self to the point of effective political challenge is the urban question of our day. While I do not know how to get there exactly, I do know that it will not be as easy as running roughshod back into our grandparents' collective living room. And this is where I can return to the subject-object dynamic and try to imagine what is to be done within the urban spaces that we will build tomorrow. It's a way of saying that 19th century spaces will not cut it for so many reasons. We cannot go back to pre-modern urbanism. It seems absurd to have to argue against relying on urban paradigms that predate the world of freeways and airports, that predate the world of endless tracts of mass housing and commercial floor plates the size of football fields. It's a world that our ancestors could not imagine, let alone accommodate. Furthermore, our backsliding into more comfortable mode of political action often suggests that the spaces and forms we build today are lacking in political significance. This is not the case. Urbanism is made by, it is the urbanism that is made by our own hand, the urbanism that is no longer built on a substrate of blocks and streets, that constitutes the viable point of departure in our search for political identity. And I'm about as sure as that as I am of the fact that forms influence our actions, and as our actions influence our forms. Thanks.
Thank you, Albert. There's a lot there to unpack, and I'm sure we'll get to it in the discussion, especially given that you wrote that in 2014. I didn't realize it was even 2 years earlier than Mason and I had talked about. And one thing I should mention is that there's not one mention of Trump in the book, so it's really refreshing if you want to break from hearing or reading about Trump. There's not, it's a book about action, but nothing to do with Trump. But I am curious, these two are great pairings to speak about the role of protest today. We're going to shift gears a little bit and move on to the theme of factions, and I'm going to ask Cesar Lopez to take the floor.
Great. Can everyone see my screen and not my presenters?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So greetings, everyone. My name is Cesar Lopez. I'm an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico School of Architecture and Planning, and I'm an associate at the Open Workshop. My work and research focuses on the emerging building infrastructural typologies that are shaping infrastructure representation, rather, and communities in the United States-Mexico border region. Now, I grew up in the borderland of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, two cities that have historically been tied through a shared sort of bond of a shared culture and an integrated economy. the border between El Paso and Juarez is not some abstract line on a map, and it's not even just a wall. It's actually the Rio Grande River, which historically has been a wide, roaring river whose meanderings, seen on the right, muddied the legal boundary with such an ambiguity that in the border that allowed the two cities to conceive of themselves as one. Following nearly a century of legal disputes and skirmishes between the United States and Mexico between roughly 1860 and 1960, the two governments finally came together and agreed to fix and channelize the Rio Grande River to represent a single static line. Fast forward to today, coupled with unilateral border policies driven by security, has really bottlenecked the unfettered access that once sustained the transborder economy and social contact, setting off a chain reaction that, as the transformation from a loose border to a harder border, led to environmental impacts on the Rio Grande River, reducing it from a wide flowing river to a drought-ridden trickle. It limited the transborder foot traffic that has crippled the border economy, leaving behind a sea of abandoned homes and storefronts that only increased the colonization of narco trafficking in the region. Today, I'm going to present two very brief investigations on how new representations and typologies of the border can respond to emerging social issues. First, starting with my contribution to Bracket Takes Action, a project called Borderlands, which reconfigures the representational character of the Rio Grande River / border, which began with a very simple manipulation of the border's definition. Essentially, if wherever the river is, the border is, then if we were to expand that line into a space, as you see on the right, can it suddenly be free of national affiliation? To do so, I outlined a series of territorial transformations that essentially removes the upstream systems of levees and dams currently holding back the river's natural hydrological cycles and expands it into a series of tributaries. This expansion can respond to the city's cartel colonization by identifying the trafficking networks buried deep inside of city blocks and enact new architectural actions to subtract concealing walls and expose the negligent spaces and their activities within the borderland. The International Water and Boundary Commission, responsible for the Rio Grande's maintenance, can excavate the uncovered grounds and flood through a newly expanded Rio Grande River, literally replacing the very ground that the cartel operates on with a wide and flowing river. Now, by connecting the remaining floor plates and foundations, border publics can circulate within the river and not just over the river, recharging the trans-border foot traffic needed to sustain the economy within this borderland, while allowing the communities to self-police their own cities. Now, these spaces can become trading routes, they can become immigration routes, informal markets, or formal markets, or entirely new engagements, because the intent is to embrace indeterminacy of an unaffiliated space, nationally unaffiliated space, and give the border publics a chance to define it for themselves. Because if crossing the Rio Grande River is crossing a border, then crossing the river's tributaries multiple times will give the border a sense of ambiguity, destabilizing its power on the lives of border publics, because ultimately the United States-Mexico border will always exist. The borders are a political and cultural reality. However, this project reconfigures the Rio Grande River / border in such a way that no longer affirms separation. Now, this same trajectory since then of research has brought me to another border region that I recently began a long-term research collaboration with Marcel Sanchez and Adriana Cuellar at the Collaborative Research Office of Tijuana, Mexico. Essentially being prompted by the recent shifts in the United States political climate towards immigration, which we've all seen, highly even more politicized in the last few weeks, coupled with stricter immigration policies that have led to an increase in deportations. So what emerges out of these politics is a brand new sort of labor population that is not like the seasonal daily laborer that the national news media in the United States loves to profile. These deportees have spent nearly their entire lives in the United States. They're bilingual, college educated, and relatively savvy with technology. They choose to reside in informal communities immediately along the border to remain close to family, friends, social networks, and essentially the country that they would still call home. This group is attracting new non-manufactured industries such as call centers to the border region. These call centers are seeking to capitalize on bilingual workers with cultural wealth and knowledge of America. As labor economies shift further towards data and technology, it's clear that industries such as call centers will be the next generation of maquiladoras in this region. However, these industries are often set up haphazardly as bounded sheds, ignoring the exceptional political landscape that they inhabit. The history of border labor suggests that deportations will continue to set off a boom of industries seeking to capitalize on the cheap and skilled labor that's now there. Therefore, we asked ourselves, can a new building typology that leverages a deeper understanding of the worker and their communities offer us a new way of reversing the exploitative model associated with border labor? We tested this investigation this past spring in a graduate urban research studio at UC Berkeley, largely because the three of us happened to be there teaching at the same time. And we investigated ways that edges and limits reverberate from the border itself into the city of Tijuana, from systems and infrastructures, the distribution of demographics, to the architectural character of housing, labor, and civic centers created by geopolitics. We also coupled this research with a series of case studies to instigate new formats of the interior workspace, ultimately retooling them to create public interface and inclusive environments for a labor group that has largely been marginalized by immigration politics. Final propositions towards a new building typology for call centers subverted the bounded industrial shed that is largely the historic character of the maquiladora into an unbounded interior that engages with the city. This was important for us because we wanted to find ways that the deportees can overcome social displacement, even though they are in the country of their origin, of their birth country, essentially. This is not the country that they spent their entire lives in. We found that unlike the maquiladoras, these labor centers are no longer tied to distribution routes in the periphery of border cities. Instead, they are able to be sited deep in the center of cities, ingrained within the city, close to the deportee workforce that these call centers largely rely on, presenting an opportunity to intersect the infrastructural resources these industries bring, such as water or electricity, with informal communities that don't have them, sort of like a social service to the city, framing new labor community centers typologies that leverage global capital interests to sustain communities struggling with socio-political issues. Now, these works and interests finally have led me to where I am today. Because of my interest in territorial politics, I am residing in the border region in the state of New Mexico, just a couple of 100 miles from this US-Mexico border, where I'm hoping living in this area will largely give me an even deeper understanding of how political, social, and economic structures are ultimately dictated by the border itself, and seek ways for how our built environments can be designed in such a way to subvert subjectivity and the inclusion-exclusion dynamics present in everyday life in the border region. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cesar. It's great to see both your article and some of the newer work that has come out of some of those earlier studies. Last but not least on our presenter lineup today is Laurie Brown. Laurie, please take the floor, and for anyone out there listening, feel free to add any questions that you might have to the presenters into the chat, and Mason and I will be curating from there shortly.
All right, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be a part of this and look forward to the discussion afterwards. My contribution to Bracket was titled Spaces of Conflict. And in my 10 minutes, I want to give you a bit of a framing of that work and then what has happened as a result in many years since. So this was really a book, well, it comes from a book that was looking at issues of conflict in space, contested spaces in North America, and primarily spaces of reproductive healthcare access. And one of the aspects that happened as a result of this research was having the ability to be able to take action directly as a result of the research that I've been doing. And I'm very interested in this work and subsequent work where our legal system, whether that's through legislation or the judicial system, has a direct impact on how we understand space and how we have access to space and how space is actually limited through these different legal devices. And because what I'm talking about is really focusing on Roe v. Wade, which was a Supreme Court decision from 1973, and that guaranteed a woman's federal right to an abortion in the United States. And this decision was grounded in issues around privacy. And as you may or may not know, Justice Ginsburg has critiqued that decision on numerous occasions, and that she thought it was actually not a good basis for something that has continued to remain contested since 1973. And in this distinction between privacy and public, it reinforces gender divisions. And these are deeply entrenched, these divisions, within Western political theories of freedom, personal autonomy, patriarchal familial sovereignty, and private property. As the geographer Nancy Fraser has just written, these binaries are entrenched within our political philosophies, law, popular discourse, and general spatial practices, and are used to legitimate oppression, regulate and exclude aspects of sexualities and differences, and really reinforcing a patriarchal heterosexual power. And these take the form from a Supreme Court case as an example from 2001 that defined distances around bodies and buildings in terms of protecting those coming in and out of these zones. It also has influenced through looking at issues of state rights and state governance. This was published in the book in 2012, so I'll want to just highlight 3 states at the time of the publication had only 1 clinic per state, and today we have 6 states with only 1 clinic, and this keeps hovering back and forth. It's a very fluid, not a fixed situation. I've had the opportunity to work with 2 abortion clinics in design ways, and I want to just highlight quickly Huntsville, Alabama. They were interested in creating a more protective and secure environment around their clinic. They received a number of protesters. So I worked with them to really think about what does a wall mean? How do we think about the publicness and accessibility combined with the right to protest, and thinking about this wall that would have different faces and different abilities depending on whose side it was looking at. So on the public side, it would be quite thick and would allow for a watering system to be used just in time when protesters are there, who may or may not get watered in the process, as well as creating a lush kind of landscaped environment on the inside to create a kind of a more soothing kind of space for those who have to wait for their friends or loved ones inside, because you cannot go inside when procedures are happening. Another aspect of this work has also dealt with building codes. And I think it's important to understand that building codes have been incredibly politicized in and around reproductive healthcare access in this country. And as a result of presenting this to a number of very diverse audiences, it came to my, I became aware that lawyers were having challenges arguing in front of the courts why these building code changes were not, should not be approved. So myself and research assistants did an analysis of some of the most restrictive states and their building codes that were working to change an abortion clinic from a medical facility to one that required ambulatory building codes. And this may on paper, and this is the argument, not be that detrimental, but it incurs an enormous amount of expense moving walls just inches, creating different kinds of HVAC systems, or even having to install expensive sprinkler systems. So these actually began to close clinics across the country, and specifically within the state of Texas. And HB2, which was a state law that was begun implementation in 2013, started to close these clinics over the time of its implementation. So the gray zones or regions across Texas, which is the second largest state in the country, where women would have to drive over 150 miles one way to find a clinic. This eventually led to a Supreme Court decision, Whole Women's Health, which was decided in 2016, where an architect, George Johannes, actually was an expert witness and had done an analysis of buildings and their expenses and the requirements of these building code changes. And the Supreme Court determined that this was a completely illegal requirement to force abortion clinics to change their buildings to meet these building codes, as well as allowing or requiring doctors to have admitting privileges, which is within 30 miles of their clinic. So at this point, the design of these clinics became highly contested. The Supreme Court said you can't do it. And then in this year, June Medical Services versus Russo, a similar case made its way to the Supreme Court, which they thankfully upheld precedent from 2016 and deemed that also illegal. So there's a series of ongoing legislation that chips away at the ability of clinics to remain open and the spaces that they have. More recently, I'm collaborating with a lawyer and a women's studies professor and a Latinx scholar on the Garza versus Hargis decision. And this decision or series of litigations was on behalf of unaccompanied, undocumented minors who were being held in detention, who were seeking to terminate their pregnancies. Often these pregnancies resulted from the journey from Central America to the US, and they sometimes would arrive and not know they were pregnant. And since 2017, the Office of Refugee Resettlement has had refused their access to reproductive health care for abortion. If they wanted to keep the pregnancy, that wasn't a problem. So we're through our disciplinary lenses, we're analyzing the series of cases that have come up. It's been an ongoing kind of legal kind of gymnastics. I'm particularly interested in the spaces that are being discussed through, it was Judge Kavanaugh, now Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh, who was talking about the spaces of shelter and detention compared to a good space to make a decision for. And I'm using the lens of Agamben and Foucault to talk about spaces of exception, as well as the biopolitics and the autonomy of the body. Just last week, the ACLU, who's been leading this charge against the government, has announced that the ORR has decided to change their policies. So I'm not certain yet if this is it's done, or if there's still going to be impending court cases in the future. And then this brings us to the present and COVID. Not surprisingly, some of those very same states who have only one clinic are also states that have tried to use COVID as a rationale to deem that abortion is not a medically necessary procedure. And it's important to note that the UN Working Group for the Discrimination Against Women and Girls have stated that we regret that these states that are mentioned have a long history of restrictive practices against abortion, appear to be manipulating the crisis to severely restrict women's reproductive rights. And they want to reiterate that sexual and reproductive health services, including access to safe and legal abortion, are essential and must remain a key component of the UN's priority to its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And just to close, I think it's important for architects and designers to think about the role the law plays in our ability to think about and create and define space and space of access for a variety of contested spaces. And given that there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court, these issues are even more critical as we look to see what happens in the next several months. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. And thank you to all our presenters for fantastic summaries of the pieces in your contribution to the bracket book, but also thank you for taking the time to situating it within recent work that you're doing and referring to some ongoing urgent issues in terms of contemporary events. I think there's a number of ways we could engage in a conversation for a bit before opening up to some Q&A from our audience members, which, by the way, keep them coming, please, in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to type them in. Sometimes you might get a response directly from one of our participants, or we'll elevate it up and bring it into the kind of discussion circle. Some quick thoughts from me, and we'll see if that generates some conversation, and then maybe Niraj can do the same. I was really struck by the dialogue across a series of the talks and ways of approaching the notion of action and design. In particular, I was thinking about notions of barriers and permeability as it relates to Cesar and Lori's presentations, thinking about the challenge of either increasing permeability or trying to negotiate permeability, whether it be political borders or whether it be a barrier, a kind of safety barrier between protesters and citizens. And I was also struck in Sema and Albert's talks about notions of plurality and citizenship. And maybe I'll start there with a question about kind of about instrumentality and maybe technology. I know, Albert, you have written extensively about streets and grids and spines, probably to the degree so much that you didn't bring it up necessarily in this talk, but this is a sort of something powerful that you've introduced to our lexicon, and probably why Ladders has been in such high demand and achieved its second printing, its new edition. And I think what's quite interesting about Sema's presentation and accounts of Tahrir is the fact that it's neither nor. In a way, it's a roundabout. It's not a square. It's a circle. It's logistical in the sense that it does engage streets, but it's also a space that was inhabitable as a kind of island, as it were. And then another interesting dialogue between your two pieces is Albert brings up the laptop and the individual and Snowden, and Tahrir as a means of collectivity actually quite powerfully used Twitter and other forms of social media. And yet, Sema, you bring this kind of beautifully crude physical model and this pamphlet that wasn't even produced. I don't know if it went, how viral it went, but you described it as something that was almost more like a zine that was handed out. So there's some strange maybe contradictions or dialogues happening across, this may be also cultural geographical distinctions, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit about spines, grids, and nodes with regard to the specificity of Tahrir, and I think Albert's powerful kind of aerial view of that role of infrastructure. And this doesn't preclude Lori or Cesar from chiming in. I think infrastructure actually is a theme throughout all the presentations, but maybe as a starting point, it would be interesting to hear you reflect upon the dialogue across your presentations.
Well, I don't know. I'm afraid I haven't looked at Tahrir Square. I'm surprised that my impression was that has never been that it's an island or that it's not intensely connected into the fabric. So I would have a hard time making a specific reference to that. I think it's, if it is, it's even more interesting to me. I think a lot of our given the discontinuities in the cities that we build, we really need the electronic infrastructure to compensate for it. such that when you have discontinuous spaces, what you're really relying on is it is an event, as opposed to something that we saw far more common in the 19th century, which is where crowds would gather, maybe in their origins, rather casually, but it had to do with the crowd formation, had to do with the continuities and the ebb and flow between daily spaces and the scene of protest. And I think in a important way, we have overcome the fact that we don't have those continuities necessarily anymore in a lot of the built environment, but that it has nonetheless been overcome with social media. I guess any could argue about a lot of media. So it doesn't, even though I just assumed that Tahir Square was integrated, and that it was more of a spontaneous crowd, it doesn't surprise me that it nonetheless gained its importance. And undoubtedly, and I know of through the spread of the word through Twitter.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Sorry, just to jump off of that, so Tahrir is it is a very important connecting node, but it's only for cars, right? And so it brings in over 20 streets from all over Cairo, and it's basically almost never been, that central green area before 2011 was never accessed by pedestrians, almost, just to jump around and to cross streets. I had a friend who visited and lived in Cairo for a while, and we call it the circle of death. So just to cross the street. So it was not friendly to pedestrians at all. And so in that way, I think it's interesting to think of it as a central node, but something that never tried to collect people or to have any kind of, to be any kind of public space. But to think, it's undoubtedly that Twitter and Facebook were central to gathering people out there. But I think what, for example, the Tufekci book that I was mentioning, Twitter and Tear Gas, what she brings to light is that as important as that is for those specific moments and to gather people and to collect people with a common goal out there, it also is problematic because people can as easily as they go out there, don't come back or don't continue or don't kind of stick with that with their goal of turning it into something long term or so that's the kind of issue that I was trying to bring up. And I think yeah, it's a contradiction. And I think that model somehow, even though I could also say that the way that it reached me and the way that the memory of it is, still alive somehow because it's made of styrofoam and whatnot, is through media. So that's like the kind of other that's the purpose of it, right? Is to memorialize. I think I have there was a question in the Q&A by Sneha who kind of couples. I want to answer that separately. I'll type that in, but I like how she couples the role of technology as both an organizing mechanism, but also a memorializing mechanism. And I think that's the kind of, that's the contradiction or the dialogue that we have to, that's interesting to think about.
But I think just to build quickly on that, I think that your articulation of the model as a sort of individual expression, I feel like ties in nicely to Albert's observation of the shift from the grid to the spine as a shift from the collective to the individual and the empowerment of the individual. The model is something that's made singularly. It's once, and it might be participatory and iterative, and it might be ever changing, right? That seemed to be what you liked about it, is that the model allowed someone to participate and engage with it rather than as a sort of fixed element. It allowed someone the ability to sort of contribute to a collective authorship, but with the kind of there was only one of it. It wasn't ever replicated.
Mhm.
Anyway, super interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
Mason.
Yeah, I think there's a weird connection. There's a sort of assumed connection between technology and urban form that's usually kind of off. It's usually either technology is totally bad, it messed up our spaces, or technology is great and why we need these spaces anymore. But I think their interconnection has been interesting, and relative to what you just said, generated a different kind of polity around it. I mean, we never would have built the suburbs if we wouldn't have had TVs and telephones, right? We would never have accepted those discontinuities in our lives if we didn't have some kind of compensation for that. And I think as our cities have become more fragmented, the technologies become much more sophisticated. And I think the sort of hybrid events that they're creating, like your approach to Tahir, are exactly what we should be looking out for. They're not like the events that we normally associate with street protests, and that also does, I think, importantly extend to the historical or the documentation of it. And I think in that way, it's I mean, the only way I can continue to think about that stuff is to find ways that we have been able to overcome the physical limitations. But I think more than just overcoming them, it's produced these new hybrid events that are altogether positive.
It's a great point. Thank you as well for all those amazing presentations. And just to piggyback on this conversation and introduce the question of legibility that was brought up very early on in the talks by Samit's presentation. And these are tough things to bring together because Cesar and Lori presented sort of design, kind of proactive design approaches versus Albert and Samit's pieces in the text, which are looking less at design and more at a kind of situation and trying to unpack it. But I was interested in sort of particularly Lori and Cesar in your design projects that you put forward. It seemed like the design move was to take a line that was very clearly the edge of an oppressive power regime. And in Lori, in your case, I remember this amazing photograph in the book of just a line of paint, on the ground in front of a clinic that was almost one of the clearest, most legible forms of where the extension of the body happens in urban space. And Cesar, of course, the border, as we know, is a kind of political line that has been obviously politicized. And in both cases, you guys have kind of spread that line into a space or a zone. And by doing so, I don't know if that was to make the power of that line, to dissipate that power or to make it less legible, but there does seem to be the kind of opening up of that space in between. And I was curious if you could talk about that against some of the kind of calls of Sama and Albert. Sama, you're looking at the model as the thing that produces legibility on the ground for the thing that we can't make sense of from from that perspective on the ground. And Albert, in your case, I know a lot of your work around legibility, but it seemed like in the piece specifically for Bracket there, and you say it, that it's not a simple us versus them in the protest, just as much as it's not clear what the forms of action should be to respond to these new urban forms. It also seems like it's also not clear who we are protesting to, like who is the person on the other end, what are the levers that we push on. So there does seem to be some claim there about producing legibility of who those actors might be. Maybe I'm reading in between the lines here, so correct me if I'm wrong. But I think this kind of question of legibility and seeing it in space becomes a really interesting one to think about our role as designers and spatial activists. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in there, but I guess Lori and Cesar, for you two particularly, like just that act of opening up the line into a space. If you could just talk a little bit more about the goals of that, as kind of the political goals around that.
I think for me, how does one, I believe very fervently in the First Amendment and the right to protest. And what I was finding in a lot of the legal doctrine was that the right to protest supersedes the right to physically access a building. And time again, that line of the clinic property became like, if you can get to it, great. And if not, well, those people have the right to protest. So really thinking about how does one defend and protect that line, all the while providing a space for protests to continue. But I became far more invested in the safety and integrity of the clinic and their ability to stay open and have that front door accessible. So although it expands that line, there's definitely a kind of entrenchment and holding it as well. And I think that is one of the most challenging parts of this kind of work, is wanting to be able to address both issues or not exclude the other. But some of the protests, especially in the clinic in Mississippi, it's so radicalized and there's so many people and it's so loud that that line becomes really important to preserve for the patients and the employees to access the property. So I think, and then I think that what is the role of aesthetics in that too, which becomes really important in thinking about how one images and fronts their communities, but yet maintaining kind of a safety around it as well.
Yeah, you're muted.
I was on mute, which happens to me daily. So I think one thing that really pops out to me, especially in looking back at this work, is that just how much, even though the border does present, you know, some subjectivity in terms of national affiliation, it at the same time presents a lot of opportunity. It's not necessarily the physical border as in the wall or as in the river, but it's the economic border that people capitalize on. A lot of people within that region and other border regions will work in the US but live in Mexico, where the disparity in you know, monetary value changes dramatically, right? And so for me, when kind of evaluating a new configuration for the border, it became important that the border had to still be there. The border had to still be somewhat legible in order for it to continue to allow sort of a hacking of two different economies. Because honestly, with the poverty and precarity, economic precarity that exists in the borderland, that's actually the one savior, is that people are able to use both ends of the border and kind of stitch together a straggling life. And so when it came to how to reconceive of that, of a border, it became clear that just loosening it or making it ambiguous, allowing it to be there, but not allow it to be a determining factor in someone's everyday life or in the way that they come into contact, despite the fact that economically it was strained. It you know, from a more sort of macro level, but the larger strain really came from the fact that people were no longer able to buy their groceries on either side or work on either side or kind of stitch together a binational existence. And that's ultimately the way I saw the diluting of legibility, is the ability to allow more binational existence.
Yeah, it's interesting, by opening up that space, and I think Cesar, in the project you presented, just because of the scale of the project, it opens up a lot of programmatic and other forms of economic activity in that space that might get rid of that binary of A and B and a line in between. But, you know, just going back to Albert's kind of comment earlier, and maybe I'll put you on the spot here, Albert, you know, when you say, you know, actions influence forms, and forms then in turn influence our actions, or vice versa. The forms that we are acting or producing, they're not really being produced by us. Those forms that you mentioned, the highways, you know, the tract housing, we're quite disconnected from the production of that form, yet it's still acting on us. So I'm just curious, and I think this is where, Sami, in your article and in your presentation, you know, the model acts as a representational tool to connect us to something that is much bigger, but it's actually, you know, it's a representative tool, right, of the kind of larger territory that is being mapped. I'm just curious, and this is, you know, maybe coming from Albert's presentation, but anyone feel free to jump in. Where are those levers that we might push on given how disconnected we are from producing the spaces around us in the current kind of way that space is formed through economics and so forth?
Our politics are imperfect, to say the very least. And when I think, for example, of the New Deal, I think of a much more direct connection to the larger scale projects that occurred at that particular time, and that we've, of course, since lost because of the direction that our politics has taken, to the end at which we're now looking at. Perhaps, I don't know when the Green New Deal actually became a serious proposition, but I believe sometime in the last couple of months it has. And I find it fascinating to speculate on what a return to Keynesian economics would mean in the 21st century, or what a welfare state, and it certainly couldn't be called that, but what a more direct control, a direct democratic control could do with regards to the built environment. And I think our present alienation from the city and the landscape has its origin in our politics. And you just don't, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that you go back and you see you see a real functioning democracy, which we don't have now. But you see at least the outlines in, say, the TVA project, right? Tennessee Valley Authority, amazing thing that was done there. Couldn't have been done by a county or even a city. It was this large federally funded program, which only, preempted by the war, whatever, however you want to project that history, turned us in another direction, but the potential is still there. So I don't accept the alienation from the environment that I understand it and I feel it, but I don't accept the alienation from the environment of large scale decisions. And I don't think any of us should. I think part of a job of our job as designers and architects is to make it clear that it doesn't have to be that way, and that there's another way to think, especially about large scale projects. If that's close to an answer to your question.
For sure. Yeah, I definitely, there's more things I could say, but, there is kind of a question of, are you going into your other grandparents' closets with the TVA example, and looking at a different form of nostalgia of space and a regime that's also kind of passed. So, there's also, for me, this kind of question of within the things you list, like freeways, suburban tract housing, within that kind of paraphernalia of the contemporary city, is there a project within those protocols? But Lori, I also want to pass to you.
Well, I think also it calls into question, what is our discipline? What's the future of our discipline, and what role do we have to play? And I think we've ceded so much of our expertise to other areas. And, even thinking about who creates the requirements that we have to fulfill, right? Developers have so much power. We have to become more engaged with the kind of earlier phases of the possibilities of projects for us to matter. And I think, and we aren't right now. We don't teach that. I don't think we teach it well. And I don't think we as a profession are primarily interested in the kind of legalistic aspects, which are so important and powerful in the construction of the built environment. And I think it's not about the object, but it's about all the things that produce or enable that object to happen. So for me, it's about how do we define the future of the discipline in ways that become far more proactive in engaging just a much wider array of possibility of space making, whether that's through building codes or planning, and build, I don't know about scales of projects. I don't know I don't think in our current political environment and our current economic environment, that's necessarily possible.
I was thinking about that when you were presenting about it. Was really powerful to see the expanded version of the project to include the study in Huntsville and elsewhere as examples. It's almost like case studies in negotiation, and how these new knowledge bases were required of you as an architect to understand legalese, to understand code at the level of this kind of novel building typology, which isn't so easily, residential, commercial. And I was thinking, Lori, and I, I wish we could give all of you 20 minutes instead to present, but I think the conversation is just as interesting. But I was thinking, Lori, about your powerful, collaboration around the Now What exhibition on advocacy, activism, and alliances. And I wonder if you have some thoughts related to this conversation of form and action and agency and citizenship, that I know it's a study of 50 years of agents of change, of architects operating as agents of change, but are there some things that are particularly rising to the top that relate to either current events today, or more broadly this idea of faction and interaction that we brought up at the front of the event?
Rereading, your request of us to talk about the events more in a contemporary way, I've been thinking a lot about the emerged groups around issues of racism and systemic inequality and white privilege and white supremacy. And I think like Design as Protest and the work of Brian Lee, and the kind of Who Builds Your Architecture, like all of those groups are so important in raising the questions and the awareness, and also change making, and thinking about, the Black professors from Columbia who sent the letter and the call this summer about our curriculum across architecture schools. And, having Sharon Agrada Stone in our exhibition, and the work the movement she was involved in as a student at Columbia in the late 60s and early 70s in her recent book, like it is cyclical, and we see these amazing, the things and people have done over the decades that, with the gay rights movement and AIDS and housing for people with AIDS in New York City. I mean, there's been just these amazing histories that the exhibition's really trying to highlight, to show that actually we as a discipline have been quite engaged, just maybe more smaller pockets. But I feel like there's such a wave right now, which is super exciting, that not only students, but faculty and alumni are really pushing all of us to take, to be more responsive to how we think about educating our future students and changing the discipline. So, I mean, in terms of 2020, it's like, to me, this explosion of organizations and people coming together. And I think it's having an amazing impact, and we have to sustain it. We have to update the exhibition to include this. So we've got a long list of things to add, which is, I think, incredible, and speaks to the kind of intensity of efforts that have emerged in even the last 9 to 12 months.
I think if I could just add something to what Lori said about, our departments and our faculty kind of rethinking curricula and syllabi and things of that sort. And I just think too, over the summer, also the notes on credibility that came out at the GSD, and what that did was more than, I mean, there were specific points in there, about changing, increasing BIPOC faculty and students and resources and so on. But I think the series of conversations that came from that with these curriculum crits, right, is something that I've never seen. I've been at the GSD for a while, so it's something that I've never seen, where we're not just talking about like quotas anymore, or like representation, but we're talking about frameworks, right? Like how are we even, the students are going into studio wanting to know why they're even, you know, the prompt is even to do, you know, so and so, or to like think about the to design whatever project they're designing. And so we're talking about frameworks, we're talking about modes of representation, we're talking about what it even means to be required to do, you know, 4 perspectives and 2 sections and 5 plan, you know, like what are these basic, this list of stuff that we're always required to do that we never question. And I think that's where the real, like, this is where the conversation gets very interesting.
I think in many ways, I think that is essentially where it starts. I mean, when it comes to education, I feel like it has a lot to do with not just who's enrolling in our schools and making sure that recruitment is done in a more equitable fashion, but also that they are as well feel the call, that they feel the empowerment of what a, you know, sort of decolonized education model for architecture could be like. And I think it has to do with rethinking the ways we draw, rethinking the ways we align, or even conflate our own values with the way we draw, right? And thinking about our own politics within the way we do things, because so often we're in schools, you know, many people are told to sort of divorce yourself from your work, or to not think in that way, or not to take on the role of the activist. It's only been very recently that we have. And I think with regards to the disciplinary role of the future, which I think it does start in education, but I think it also, you know, economically, would a lot of architects or would a lot of practitioners say no to a commission that they may be ethically opposed to, but they're actually economically required to take? And it really kind of brings a question of, like, how have we set up ourselves in the economy as mainly a service industry, as opposed to a need that could mitigate inequality or exclusion within space.
It's really well said, and I really like where the conversation's going in terms of remaking the discipline itself as a meta project. I want to shift gears a little bit and jump into the Q&A and give some time to those that have taken the time to write some questions here. And in terms of, you know, as we talk about remaking the discipline, we're obviously hampered by our own ancestors and our own biases that we were educated in. And, you know, we could also say the same thing for form. The first question from Craig here is about monuments and the idea of, is there the idea of a equitable monument or a pluralistic monument? You know, and maybe to add to that, are, you know, monuments still part of our lexicon, or should be part of our lexicon? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in to talk about their views on monuments, particularly in the wake of what we've seen more recently in terms of dismantling monuments or shifting the agenda of certain monuments.
Yeah, I mean, I briefly tried to reply in the chat. I'm not sure I was that articulate because I was also trying to listen to presentations, but I think definitely like, to the second question, right? Not one monument cannot truly ever represent the multitude of perspectives, and I think that's been made clear, you know, over the last, you know, few decades, not even this year. But I think that's where the equitable legibility that Craig is talking about, I think that's what we have to think about. And I think that's where examples like that I ended with a bit, like the model or the BLM projection in Richmond, Virginia, those start to, I mentioned kind of like the idea of the counter monument in the end, but I also think that needs to, you know, that's kind of an older idea now, but I think there has to be some sort of rethinking of memorials and space making and, like, remembering, because otherwise what happens is the obelisk, right? We do go back to this monument and we have no kind of sort of other remnants of the space. So I guess maybe less enduring monuments, but then that's also a contradiction. So I don't know, I'm thinking out loud.
I think to ask the question about monuments is really to ask a political question. And that question goes something like, are we ever going to come together again, right? I don't think that the monuments just appear because architects think they're good or bad. They appear because of the social conditions that produce a shared agreement about what is to be revered and cast permanently into stone or cast into history, and what is not. And at the moment, I think it would be kind of strange. Well, I mean, we could, these exhibitions for projected monuments. I mean, we could float the idea of monumentality and keep it alive, but it's not alive until there's an agreement, a political agreement. So as far as buildings, making monuments in this country at this point in time, I think it's problematic.
I mean, in some ways, I feel like monuments implies a sort of positivism too, as though it's a physical structure. Like monuments also can be voids, they can be negative spaces, they can be defined by absences. And in some ways, I mean, it is interesting, once it became a positivist mass, it then became a new canvas from which to enact counter monuments upon. And so, it's sort of interesting how it sort of then, and that becomes the erasure of it is to sort of, not only literally the defacing, like to take the word defacing, to remove a face, but also to render it effectively inept at communicating whatever it was monumentalizing before. Yeah, super rich conversation that could come out of that. I think Sama's text is really key there. We've maybe got time for one more question. There is and we can spin out from there if anyone would like to take it in other directions as well, but there was a question about other agents, other species, literally. An anonymous attendee asked, in dialogues about the future of spaces, how are you carving out spaces for more than humans? How, if at all, are you picking up post-humanism in your work and thinking? I don't know if this relates to anyone in particular, but if anyone would like to pick up pieces there relative to current thinking or their bracket contribution, that'd be great.
Well, I don't know how much my project can relate to that, but I think that was definitely a strategy in my project of taking what once was a river with very natural habits and tendencies, and sort of desystematizing it, and and sort of erasing not just the channel, but also erasing the systems of levees and dams upstream, which, if I can try to make the bridge here, is a monument to a policy, right, or to an agreement, right? And I think in many ways that to me was a very post-human act, right? Because it was really, the majority of my project, I found myself designing for the river, not necessarily for people. And I actually kept having to bring that conversation back to myself because I honestly just kept forgetting it. And so it's, I do think there might be a connection there, and it could, I think, give us a potential way to think about borders and think about boundaries or limits or edges that exist in our environments, and just thinking of just how exactly unnatural they actually are, and how natural edges, their boundaries naturally fluctuate or grow or decrease, etc., and almost accepting that indeterminate aspect of it.
Well, it's interesting you didn't really bring that aspect into your presentation. It's the one that I thought of the most. This is a little bit of a digression. The geology of Texas was put into place 20,000 years ago. So the Rio Grande has been running for at least 20,000 years. And I think that just the connection, to me, the most powerful thing about what you showed is what happens when you take away in the face of 20,000 years, the little pathetic dams that we use to try to control the water for this tiny brief period of time, and think through really what what it means to base a border on that, or to bring that into the discussion of border, I thought was terrific. And it does take us out of, it does what the post-human should do, which is take us out of our little in the moment, fracas that we have around all of the issues, and they're important, but then there's a bigger frame of reference to look at all of this in, which I think is a pretty important part of the project that you showed us.
Which I think that's such a difficult thing to do. I like the way you framed that, kind of like throw us out of our bubble or pop the bubble when we consider the larger history. But because collective memory is so short and virtually non-existent today, I think it's important to inscribe notions of memory within space, no matter how it's designed, right? I'm actually right now, it's funny that you say that, because I'm actually advising and collaborating on a project with the Land Arts program at Texas Tech on redrawing the Rio Grande River in its entirety, but redrawing the meanderings all at once. Much like what they did to, much like what a group did to the Mississippi River. I think and I think it's very important to even think about the way we draw, right? Like that conflates the way as architects or designers or any sort of spatial thinkers or makers or recorders draw as to draw the river in a static point as represented by infrastructure, or design the river through its furthest, most recorded memory, could give us a more sobered reality of the geographies that we live in, is by overlapping states of history.
Yeah, expanding our time.
I also think the non-human look should be far more foregrounded given the climate crisis, and we're at a point where we can't ignore that. And to think about your project, Cesar, through that lens, to me, could completely reconfigure what that landscape, how you represent what you talk about in that landscape, whether it becomes, what are those extremes? How do they fluctuate? So I think the question is incredibly valid, and that, I can't find the relevancy for my particular project, but I think as the discipline, as the future of the planet, we have to, there's no question about it. We can't be the center any longer. We cannot.
Yeah.
It's a great place to wrap up. And I'm
I'm
glad the conversation went into questions of representation, because this is also obviously a big part of what we do as designers, and there's encoded politics in the way that we draw and model the world and how we then react. Similarly to Albert's statement about actions and form, we could say something similar around how we represent and therefore produce form through that representation. Just want to thank everyone once again, and thank those in the audience that offered questions out to the panelists. I'm going to pass the mic over to Mason, and we'll just have a couple of wrap-up notes before moving on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Albert, Sema, Lori, and Cesar, for such thoughtful presentations. And I know it's never enough time to do these really sort of hot takes from deep, many years of thinking and research. But what's most interesting, I think, today, with all of us finding new solace of socializing through online mediums, is the conversation element. And I thought it was a really rich discussion. We probably could have just gone straight to the dialogue and conversation, but I think it was great for you all to meet each other and see each other's talks. So thank you so much. And thanks to our audience for joining us today for session 2. We will actually have one more final takes action session on November 11th, hoping for a new dawn, new day south of the border from me, where maybe some of you are dialing in from. And that will be at 4 p.m. Eastern time and 1 p.m. Pacific time. To see and register for any of the Daniels event where I am based, you can go over to our news and events page on the Daniels faculty website.
And to see the rest of the CCA architecture events this fall, please visit scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. The next event in the CCA lecture series is a lecture by Mario Gooden, author of Dark Space, an investigation into construction of African American identity and representation through the medium of architecture. which is coming up on October 12th at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time.
And the next event in our series is titled Distancing Density and features Daniel DeOka from Harvard GSD in Interborough and author and placemaker Jay Pitter based here in Toronto. This is a 1 week from today at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you again to our speakers and our patient audience. We'll see you online again soon. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
It's a
you all.
pleasure.